Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you're all doing fine. I should say I'm actually feeling a lot better now. I had strep throat. I went to the doctor, they gave me antibiotics, and I felt better within like 12 hours. Crazy. Um, Go to the doctor, people. Medicine is amazing if it's done ethically, of course. Um, so I wanted to talk this week about research on children and then research in developing countries. These are two topics which have like really specific and unique ethical implications. And I kept coming back to discussions related to autonomy. Autonomy and consent, and what I'll go over this idea called assent, which is very important too. Um, so I decided to actually make this kind of a joint lecture on both topics. And we are going to really talk about autonomy and then take detours into these topics as a way to sort of explore autonomy a little bit. All right. Um, Let me lay out two things here. Right. So there are two notions which are incredibly important and related to each other. Right. So we have autonomy and we have consent. Um, these aren't synonymous, but they're heavily related. I have a little reading on this that actually I wrote back when I was in my master's. Um, so make sure to check that out. But we have autonomy and consent. These are two related but distinct topics. And I'm going to give you guys kind of my view about how these topics relate to each other and exactly what autonomy is or how it can be measured. Sort of just like a very broad theoretical view. Okay. So take this. Um, we have our little box here. And we can think about autonomy as being something that is scalar. And what I mean by that is autonomy isn't a black or white thing. It's not something where you're either autonomous or not autonomous necessarily, but it's sort of a level, right? So we can think of the top here as being a case of, if you fill up all the way to the top, then we can say that you are fully autonomous. And then if you're all the way at the bottom, then you are not autonomous at all. All right. And, for most decisions or most impacts, most parts of people's lives, they're like probably mostly autonomous. They have a good amount of control over their lives, but there are a variety of different things which may impact people's ability to be fully autonomous. For example, if we just think of autonomy as the ability to control your life, um, even something as simple as, like being sleep deprived could make you not fully autonomous, right? So, let's say, maybe if you're sleep deprived, you're like right here, you're like pretty high up, but you're not like fully high up or anything like that. Um, but you can think about autonomy as being something that's gradual. And think about this, right? So, when you're drunk, you're not fully autonomous. That seems obvious. That's why sexual consent goes away when people are drunk. Um, but it's not like, being drunk off of two beers is the same thing as being drunk off of like eight beers. As you have more alcohol, your level where you're able to the level where you're able to control yourself starts to go away in a way. Okay. Let's think about consent here. Or let's actually change this. Let's not talk about consent. Let's talk about what I would say is we call it the consent requirement, just to make this more clear. I think that in the same way that autonomy can be scalar, We can think of consent or the requirement to meet consent is also scalar. And what do I mean by this? Okay. So there are some decisions which require more consent than other decisions. Or sorry, which have a higher standard of consent than other decisions. And what I mean by that is there are some decisions where in order to adequately consent to that decision, you need a very high level of autonomy. And there are some decisions where in order to adequately consent to it, you need a very low level of autonomy and everything in between. Um, so take for example, I give this example in the reading, buying a bag of chips. You don't really need much autonomy at all to be able to consent to using your credit card or your debit card to buy a bag of chips. Someone can be absolutely plastered and coming out of a nightclub, stumbling into 7-Eleven, having their hands on the counter, having to hold themselves up so they don't face plant down. They could be that drunk. And the clerk is not going to be taking advantage of them if they take their money in exchange for, a bag of Doritos or something like that. Now, on the other hand, if someone's that drunk, and they try to buy, let's say, something, that's like they try to buy a house or they try and get a tattoo, and they're literally like they can't even hold themselves up, then we would say, well, no, you're not in a position to consent to that big decision. So we can think about different decisions depending on their importance and maybe some other factors as, um, in order to meet the requirement of consent, you have to have sort of some level of autonomy. So if someone has this level of autonomy and the standard for consent, the requirement for consent, um, oh, I realize I put that up wrong. The requirement for consent, not the consent requirement. Okay. So someone has that level of autonomy and the requirement of consent for some specific decision is that high, then they're not able to adequately consent to it, or they're not able to consent to it. I like to say adequately consent, just because it really enforces the idea that autonomy scalar, but most people will just say, yeah, in terms of most people's terminology, most people will just say they can't consent to it. Um, if we lower the oh God, fucking, sorry, I controlled Z'd the wrong thing. Requirement for consent. There we go. If we change it up, where the requirement for consent's like this high, then obviously you have enough. Okay, so. What are ways where someone's level of autonomy can be impacted or can be reduced? There are a couple different ways in how we can reduce someone's level of autonomy. One way which we can reduce their autonomy is by saying we can deprive them of their understanding. You can't be fully autonomous in a situation if you don't know what's going on. This is the fundamental idea behind informed consent. In order for someone to adequately consent to something, or in order for someone to consent to something in medical practice, they need to know all of the relevant details about the care that they could receive, the care that's being offered to them. And then they also need to know other details, such as what are the alternatives and stuff like that. Now, this relates to children in an interesting way. Because children, they lack understanding. They lack a certain level of cognitive capability, a certain level of maturity. So when we think about children, um, we can imagine that for most medical decisions, at least, or at least for a lot of medical decisions, they're not going to have enough autonomy to meet the requirement for consent. Usually issues related to massive things concerning someone's bodily well-being or someone's bodily autonomy. We have higher restrictions on children than we would on adults. Which is why like children can't get tattoos and stuff like this. Um, but because children lack a certain level of understanding, they're going to lack a level of autonomy, and they're not going to be able to meet the requirement for consent for at least a lot of medical practices. Now, there is a notion here, right, which is sort of a fill-in notion um, to autonomy and consent, which we can use for children. And this is the notion of assent. This is what people call it. Assent is essentially when a child makes some sort of decision, or it doesn't necessarily have to be a child, but it's usually talked about in the context of children. When they make some decision, but they have a very low level of autonomy. So this is the autonomy bar. So when they agree to something, but they don't have enough autonomy, they don't meet the requirement for consent, but they still agree to it. This is a very important notion. We can imagine, a child who needs to get his or her shots. You can think about the child who's kicking and screaming and doesn't want to get them. In this case, they clearly have not assented. They clearly don't want that. Or you can figure out the child who just says, okay, and, waits patiently and, doesn't make a huge fuss about it. And says, go ahead and give me the shot. In this case, the child has assented. You, but they still have not consented because they have not met the autonomy requirement because they lack information. Okay. What do you do in this sort of situation? When a child assents to something, but they can't consent to something. Usually, what we do is we set up sort of a proxy person or someone who can consent via proxy. Is usually the parents. Someone who will look out for the child, consider their best interest, and then make a decision for their child. And of course, like parents make medical decisions for their children well before the child can even assent, let alone consent. Um, I mean, very early on in most men's lives, most boys' lives in the United States, um, parents will decide whether or not to circumcise the child or not. By the way, this is an aside. I actually, circumcision is really interesting. I think that there are many good reasons as to why circumcision violates the medical, ethical, or sort of non-necessary, non-religious infant circumcision, I should say, to be very specific, um, violates the standard practices and principles which we uphold in medical ethics. And actually, a lot of philosophers think that non-necessary, non-religious infant circumcision is actually immoral. Um, and I'm very um, I have a lot of sympathy with that stance actually. I can get into it at some point. I probably will. Actually, I almost end up always talking to my class, not just my medical ethics classes, but almost always end up talking to my classes about circumcision, for whatever reason. Um, but anyways, um, so in general, we will set up a parent to make a decision via a child, give the parents the ability to consent for the child via proxy. Um, Now, there's an interesting question here where whether or not we should require both that the parent consents and that the child assents. And this is this seems at first to be like pretty reasonable. You know, you don't want to force the child to do something that they don't want to do. There may be some situations, we can take a look beyond medical ethics and just talk about situations concerning one's own body or a child's body, where in order to get something, the child both, or in order for something to be done ethically, the child needs to assent and the parents also need to consent. An example of this may be getting your ears pierced. A lot of children, you think about young children, young girls especially, will get their ears pierced. Um, I think most people would probably think it would be kind of fucked up if a parent forced their child to get their ears pierced. The child doesn't assent to it. Um, and most people would agree that, 10-year-old girls shouldn't be going to tattoo parlors or piercing parlors and getting their ears pierced if their parents don't want them to. Most people agree on that. Um, so at least it seems like in this case, there's both a requirement for assent by the child and consent by the parent. But you oftentimes don't have the assent requirement in medical practice, especially if it's like a super important decision, but even for just like regular things. I remember when I was a child, I never wanted to get like fillings when I had cavities. I absolutely hated that. I always had cavities. I think I just like ate too much licorice and stuff. I never wanted to do it, but my parents would always force me to do it. I think they made the right decision looking back at it, some years later now. And I don't think that anything unethical was done, that I was, forced to go to the dentist and, forced to have the drill in my teeth because I couldn't fucking brush my teeth right. I don't think there's any problem with that. So this is an example of a medical practice where um, it's completely permissible um, for parents to uh, decide for their child or to consent to something which the child has not assented to. Now, it's important to note that there are times where we can't let parents make all of the decisions. There's sort of unique cases. So there's this classic case um, where there's essentially some religions which are against blood transfusions for a variety of different reasons. The main religion which is against this is Jehovah's Witnesses, the sort of sect or offshoot of Christianity, of Protestantism. Um, Jehovah's Witnesses do not support blood transfusions. And there have been actually multiple instances in the United States where a child needed a blood transfusion to live. And they knew that the blood transfusion would save the child's life. It was pretty just clear cut. We'll give this child a blood transfusion, and the child can live. But the parents were Jehovah's Witnesses. The child was relatively young. I think the most famous case, the child was like 13 or so. And the parents refused to consent to the blood transfusion. The child assented to the blood transfusion. And in these cases, generally what happens is the blood transfusion happens. Uh, Now, is this because the child's assent overrode the parent's consent? Mostly no, or at least this is most people's view. In these types of cases, it's more just that the well-being of the child is so seriously at stake that we will then essentially think about beneficence, the principle that we should benefit the child and the principle of non-maleficence that we shouldn't harm the child, and we should value those far over autonomy in these specific cases. And in these specific cases, generally what happens is someone else, oftentimes a sort of like a judge, um, like a court judge, will actually be given the decision to make by a proxy. So we'll say like, okay, well, the parents, in the view of, most people are making the correct decision. And it seems like this decision is going to very much harm the child, so we're going to change who the proxy consenter is. It's kind of interesting. And it's messy to figure out when that should be done and when that shouldn't be done. Again, like there's no clear rules for this. Um, or at least none that we've like fully established that everybody agrees on. In these cases, as I was saying, it seems like if somebody lacks autonomy, um, and they just can't consent, consent's still important. Consent via proxy is still important. But in general, medical ethicists are, in these cases, going to then prioritize the other medical ethical principles, beneficence, non-maleficence, maybe justice, although that's generally more of a sort of communal concern. Um, okay, how does this apply to research, the child research? So most research is optional. Most studies are optional. You can either do it or not do it. And there's not really going to be any sort of permanent uh, downsides if you don't do it. And there may actually, in some research studies, there could be side effects which are terrible, which will harm the child for life, right? And in these cases, right, in order to do this, we'll need both parental consent and we'll also need the child's assent. If this is truly just like a completely optional research study, and this seems pretty fair, if it's not super important, then it seems weird to violate the child's assent. Seems weird to force the child to do it. I mean, we still want to value what children want to do with their own bodies. They just don't fully understand what's going on, so we can't give them the right to do whatever they want. Or we sometimes have to put someone else to look after them and consider their best interest. Um, but there's some research studies which are done which they're maybe not so optional when it comes to health, or I mean, they're optional in that people don't have to do them. Um, but they may be sort of the last resort that people have with terminal conditions. Maybe optional wasn't the best term. So I'll just put last resort. That seems very harsh, but it's a terrible situation, so maybe it's appropriate. You can think about a case where a child has some sort of terminal condition, and they have exhausted all the available procedures and practices that they could do. And the last resort is to give the child some sort of put the child on some sort of experimental drug, something like that. Um, in this case, we definitely need the parents' consent. but it's less clear about whether or not we need assent. I think most people would go ahead and they'll say, in this case, you really wouldn't need the child's assent. Now, what about a case where the child assents, but the parent doesn't consent, and this is the child's only possibility to survive? Um, I mean, to some extent, that case would be similar to the blood transfusion case. It would be a little bit different because this is a study, and we don't know if this is going to work or not. And in the blood transfusion case, it did work. Um, so that case is pretty unclear, in my opinion. I think that would be a very interesting essay that somebody could write. Maybe someone has written on that before, but I don't know of anyone who's written on that before. Okay, let's go back to autonomy. So, how to reduce somebody's autonomy? There is another way which you can reduce somebody's autonomy, which is by adding external pressures. Or we could just say external pressures. Um, Very arguably, honestly, not arguably, truly, there's also internal pressures, but that can reduce somebody's autonomy. For example, like OCD, where someone is required to do some sort of compulsive behavior. This is an internal pressure that's reducing their autonomy. By external pressure, I mean, I think we all know what we mean by this. Um, just some sort of influence which seems illegitimate, which is sort of prompting the person, the decision maker, to make some sort of decision. Now, there are two types of external pressure, or two ways that external pressure can impact someone's autonomy. Um, External pressure can be added. An example of this would be a boss who tells their employee, I'm going to fire you unless you sleep with me. In this case, the boss is coercing and pressuring his employee to have sex with him, and that takes away the employee's ability to consent um, because they don't have control in that situation. Um, it lowers their autonomy and then takes away their ability to consent. But there's also another way, which is sort of capitalizing off of uh, pre-existing pressures. What do I mean by this? There's this sort of classic philosophy case. It's called the Alligator River case. I love to do it in my ethics classes. Um, and in the case, there are all these people who do all these things, some of them shitty, some of them kind of gray. Um, and then, you have students rank uh, the all the characters in the story from like least es ethical to most ethical. Um, and one of the characters, right, he's this boat captain, and this woman comes to him and she says, "Hey, so we live, you know, so there's this neighboring town. It's across the water from us. And the only way to get to that neighboring town is via the bridge, as I'm sure you know, because you live in the same town as me. But that bridge broke, and my boyfriend, um, he's on the other side of this, and I'm just like in complete dis he's on the other side of the water, and I'm just complete despair because I can't see my boyfriend anymore. Could you take me across the river, so I can go see my boyfriend? And the boat captain, he's attracted to the woman, and then he sort of realizes the situation that she's in, and he says, "I'll do it if you sleep with me." In this case, the boat captain is not, in a sense, adding external pressure. He's pressuring her, but he's not changing her situation at all. What he's doing is he's capitalizing off of something that's already there, and then using that, some sort of negative condition that's already there, and then using that to add pressure. You know, I want to actually change how I phrase this. Um, so the first type of case, we could say that you can add external pressure or cause external pressure and reduce someone's autonomy by adding some sort of negative condition. And then the second case, we can say that you can reduce someone's autonomy if you're capitalizing off a pre-existing negative condition. So in that case, right, because I do want to say that the boat captain added pressure. In that case, that's bad terminology on my part. Um, but in that case, with the boat captain, he's not adding a negative condition. Um, he is essentially capitalizing off of a pre-existing negative condition in the woman's life in order to pressure her to do something that she otherwise would not do. Okay. How does this relate to the topic today? Well, I want to talk about research in developing countries. Um, this has gone longer than I would have liked, so I'm going to try and make this relatively quick. Um, a lot of pharmaceutical trials are done in developing countries for very simple and I think very arguably exploitative reasons. Uh, a variety of reasons is that it's a lot cheaper. You don't have to pay the participants as much. The regulations in those countries are oftentimes either not very tight or not enforced. And this allows drug companies to go through it faster, but then also cause a lot of harm, or be careless and reckless in certain situations. Um, and one fact that is true about these countries is that a lot of these countries lack access to proper medical care. Or a lot of people in these countries, I should say, lack access to proper medical care. Look, people in the United States lack access to proper medical care, let alone people in developing countries which don't have medical businesses there or have very few medical businesses there or don't have big pharma businesses there. And there are some cases where people will have conditions, um, oftentimes terminal conditions, and the only way they could possibly get care would be to go through these experimental trials. A lot of AIDS and HIV trials or trials for drugs related to AIDS and HIV and treatments related to AIDS and HIV are done in parts of Africa, specifically, I think Cameroon is one of the main parts. And people in some of these areas, they won't have access to medical care otherwise. And this kind of presents a really interesting case where people are having to enroll in these trials because they have no other alternatives. And by enrolling in these trials, they um, get the possibility that they'll recover, or maybe that they'll live, maybe that their symptoms will be alleviated in some sense. But then they also incur all of these risks, which they may not incur if they had access to the medical care which is available in other countries. And I think most people will hear this and they'll see this as very exploitative. What you're doing is you're capitalizing off of the pre-existing negative condition, um, which is the bad healthcare infrastructure, the inaccessible healthcare in that country, or the fact that that country has largely inaccessible healthcare. Now, there are interesting discussions about what you're supposed to do in this situation, or what we should do in this situation. Um, we could say, well, we should allow uh, sort of these trials in third world countries, but we should have some sort of international board that heavily regulates them. That seems like the obvious and appropriate thing. But then, no, if it's heavily regulated in those countries, um, then the pharma companies won't do the trials there anymore. And what have you done for the people there? Well, you've taken away their only source of medical care. Or you could maybe say, well, we shouldn't allow these in these developing countries. We shouldn't allow big pharma companies to test people in other countries, in developing countries, because it's significantly cheaper and they'll sign up for it uh, much quicker because they don't have other options. That's exploitative. But then again, what are the people there going to do? Uh, Things like this, questions related to exploitation can get very interesting really fast because it's sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Especially when you realize that the second you start regulating these thoroughly, then the pharma companies are going to pull out. Okay. I will also say that when it comes to developing nations, this first method of reducing autonomy is also comes up a lot. Or when it comes to pharma trials done by large Western, uh, by companies in, heavily industrialized, rich Western nations, um, there's oftentimes a lack of understanding because of a lack of an ability to communicate, maybe a lack of education on the part of the people there, a lack of understanding of cultural norms, that comes to play. And there's a lot of evidence that the informed consent, right, supposedly informed consent, which is given to these people in these developing nations, actually isn't adequate at all. And part of that is going to be because, well, honestly, it's going to be because these pharma companies just may not really care as much when it comes to the patients in these developing countries or the research subjects in these developing countries. They may not care as much about them as they would as the research subjects in Western countries, which is obviously fucked up. Um, but then also part of it will come from this ability to miscommunicate. So there's a lot of literature now on how you can get informed consent when a company which doesn't have any sort of connection to a culture is engaging in trials of that culture. All right, we're going to end it there. Thank you. Oh, wait, let me zoom out so you can all see my glory, my just amazing diagrams here. All right.